Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another series on the Beezone webinar. And tonight we have in the Beezone studios in Fairfax, California, James Steinberg.
Hi.
And James Steinberg has been a devotee of Adida Samraj for a number of years. And he is an author of two books, one of which is The Love of the God-Man, and another one is The Divine Distraction. And this interview came about after I listened to an interview on the radio in Occidental last week or the week before that, where Ken Rose interviewed James, and I thought it would be good for the Beezone to interview James. So, good evening, James.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
And welcome.
Thank you. So let me tell you a little bit about how this came about. As I came to Adida in 1973, and my background was I had been working in a spiritual bookstore in Boston, and so it was natural when I became Adida's student that I would be involved with him relative to spiritual traditions. And in fact, in 1974, I helped and set up, and then we opened a bookstore on Polk Street in San Francisco called the Dawnhorse Bookstore.
Uh-huh.
We moved up the books that had been in Los Angeles bookstore, and then I ordered a whole bunch more books and set up that store. And then I did that store in 1974 and 75 and some 1976, and then in 1977 I became Adida's librarian.
Now, in that interview last week with Ken Rose, you said you had also been a book owner or bookstore owner in Boston?
Dow Books.
Dow Books.
T-A-O, Dow Books. It was on Newbury Street in Boston. It's a store that originally was part of the macrobiotic community and was associated with Michio Kushi.
Now, did that relate to the East-West Journal at the time in any way?
I lived in the East-West Journal house for a while.
Okay.
I was part of that macrobiotic community before I knew about Adida.
Oh.
And so I lived in the East-West Journal house. I did some book reviews for the East-West Journal, and I was actually, for a while, their circulation person. I used to take the magazines and drop them off at all the colleges in the back of my VW van, you know. But then I started working at that bookstore, Dow Books, and there's really only two of us at a time that would work there. And that's where I actually first saw the need of listening.
And did you study with any teachers prior to Adida or Bubba Free John at the time?
Well, I had done all sorts of things starting in high school. I mean, I started with Herman Hesse, Jack Kerouac, and that was kind of my spiritual search. Leonard Cohen. I mean, those were all kinds of influences on me. And then,
And where'd you grow up? Where did you?
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles.
Yeah, and at that point there was a spiritual circuit around. So in Los Angeles, I saw Swami Satchidananda in Los Angeles. I studied, went to Rudolf Steiner lectures, and actually applied for an anthroposophic school, Emerson College in England. And every teacher I was around, I see there's a picture of Chogyam Trungpa. I saw Chogyam Trungpa in 1971. You know,
71.
Well, just
Wow.
a lecture he was giving.
Yeah.
And Pir Vilayat Khan, Sufi Sam students, Sufi Sam's
Right.
dancing, you know, here in Marin.
Yeah.
I did
Right in Fairfax.
Sufi dancing, and so, one after the other, I tried different things. I by heritage, I'm Jewish, so I tried going to Lubavitcher in Williamsburg. I met the Lubavitcher Rebbe there, and I tried many different spiritual paths. And it was in the back room at Dow Books that I saw a flyer advertising the need of listening. It was the only book out at that time, and I remember looking at a picture of Adida, and he had swept hair and was wearing sunglasses. And I said, wow, those people in Los Angeles, which of course is where I grew up, they'll believe anybody's a guru. I said, look at this guy. He looked like a surfer to me. He looked too cool.
Yeah.
And see, I expected at that point, working in a spiritual bookstore, that any real guru was going to be Hindu or Tibetan or, you know, some Sufi teacher. I just didn't expect anybody to be so young. And I didn't order the book. But the guy I worked with, Bob Bass, he ordered the knee of listening. And my parents lived in Los Angeles, and so periodically I go out to visit them. So one trip I was going out to visit them, and because I worked at the store, I could just borrow books at random. So I took 6 or 7 books with me to read on the plane. Well, it just so happened that the book that I read on the plane was The Knee of Listening. I spent, 5-hour trip. I maybe read 3 or 4 hours of that. Totally fascinated by his spiritual autobiography. And what made a big difference for me is somebody came into the bookstore who had seen Adida in Los Angeles. Of course, at that point he was just Franklin Jones. This is even prior to the Bubba Friedjon name. And this person, his name was Danny Marshall, he had been Rudy's chauffeur. And he had, Rudy had a spiritual transmission process, and he kind of did that too. So he looked in my eyes, and I felt all this Kundalini energy and so forth. And then he said, and so that was striking to me. And then he told me, he said, Adida's genuine. And he told me that Swami Muktananda had said that Adida was the most powerful man in America. He told me that. He said he'd been out to the LA and he'd seen him and he was genuine, and the Swami, and so that piqued my interest, those two statements.
And this is post autobiography of, Knee of Listening. This is after reading.
Well, I hadn't read the Knee, so that's what sparked me to read the Knee of Listening. Okay. That's why I took it with me, why I took it seriously.
Gotcha.
And then when I read it on the plane, then I went to the bookstore in Los Angeles, which was close enough to where I grew up that I could take my bicycle to the bookstore. And one day I went to the bookstore and I saw that the bookstore was just not really run that well. And later on, it was really just, they were thinking originally in Los Angeles about having a restaurant instead of a bookstore. And it really was not the kind of bookstore that was ever going to make any money or sell much, because it was the most pristine esoteric literature. Nothing popular at all. You'd never see a book on tarot or astrology or, some new age kind of thing. It was all the real traditional spiritual literature. But I saw how they were running the store, and I said to him, I think I could help you guys with making this store better. So the people who did the ordering came, and I met with them and helped them to make, because I was already working with a store in Boston and knew how to do a store. So in any case, one day I was in the store, and I went up to the counter, and the person who was working there said, "That's very unusual." I said, "What's that?" They said, "Well, that someone would see Franklin before they became a formal devotee." And then I realized that I had seen this person walking by, and I said, and just out of the corner of my eye. And I said, "Oh, so that was Franklin Jones." They said, "Yeah." I said, "I just barely saw him." He said, "Well, he saw you a lot." I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "Well, he was standing next to me and looking at you for a long time, but you weren't aware of it." I said, "No." I got on my bookstore, I left the store, I got on my bicycle, and I could barely ride the bike. I had been zapped. I didn't even know it.
It's like Hoffman after his acid mistake on...
I didn't know it was, and it was just like a regular day, and it was like a photograph that's bleached. It's so bright that it's kind of bleached out. You can't make out that much. I mean, I could barely ride my bicycle. I'm going back and forth. Everything's so bright. And after that, I remember I came up to the Bay Area and went to what they call the Meeting of the Ways. It was kind of a thing they used to have there where there were lots of different spiritual teachers. And every spiritual teacher that I would see who had a little bit of, I was feeling my Kundalini. And I never really felt that much before, And it took me a long time later to realize that Adida had initiated me into something. Mm-hmm. And at that point, the Method of Siddhas had just come out. It wasn't in bookstores yet, but it was there in the store. They had a big pyramid of books of the Method of Siddhas. So I read one, I took it home, and there was an essay in there called Money, Food, and Sex.
Right.
And working in the bookstore, all of us who worked in that store, there's really 3 of us, were the staff of the store. We used to say if we ever found a teacher that was real, we were going to become his devotee. And so we were all kind of on the search.
Right.
And I'd get real far with some teacher. And then at a certain point when they'd say there was a particular moment, are you ready to take the initiation? Are you ready to, sign on the dotted line or whatever? There would be something that would kind of stop me from doing that. when I read Method of the Siddhas, and particularly that Money, Food, and Sex, I realized now here's a teacher who could deal with me. Because I knew I was going to have to make sense out of sexuality. I mean, I grew up in Los Angeles, and there was no way with all the kind of bikini, beach bunny kind of stuff that's in LA that I wasn't going to have to deal with sexuality. I couldn't just be with a teacher who just said stuff all that stuff. I knew I was going to have to deal with money, because that's for all of us who grow up in the West. And already by that point, I mentioned I'd been a macrobiotic. I'd already done raw diet, cooked diet, a million different diets. I knew it. And here was a teacher I could see who could deal with me, who knew where I would be at. And that was very important to me. And I kept looking for some reason, because I realized if I became his student that would be, you know, I would be like now underneath, you know, someone who was going to really master me. But I couldn't find an excuse not to do it. You know, as I said, we all said it, when we find a real teacher, we're going to do it. And so the person at the bookstore said, well, you ready to sign up? And I couldn't find some reason to say no. So on September 29th, 1973, it was the day before my birthday, I was still 21, I became a devotee.